but if NatQuest had a waypoint, you'd have to know that the differences between them. So namespaces avoid that confusion. Security, and all I'm trying to do, by the way, at this stage of the presentation is to introduce you to the concepts. So if you hear them, you go, I heard this somewhere once before, by the way. I'm just trying to race through a lot of this. In security, there's this notion of credentials like passwords or some sort of key or some sort of file that's acting as something that you can validate with a third party. We're pretty much all familiar, I imagine, with sessions. And then all the issues you would deal with. Now, some environments are not going to have any of this. If you're trying to connect your data, again, I'm talking about connecting data between two systems. So if the third party is relatively open, they may have a very lightweight security model, like a simple door with a simple lock, in which case it might be very easy to hook up to it. Other environments might have very complicated systems where you have to confront this kind of early on in the project, because testing might get really hairy if you haven't figured out, like if you don't have credentials to actually test on their test server, only on the dev server, you're not going to be able to get very far. All right. So API is currently, in the old days, an API was the set of DLLs that you used to link up to a package, or it was the set of code that you had to implement as part of a solution development kit to write to something that ran on the desktop. And now we're moving to the thing where this application programmer interface thing is expanded to include web services, where we have a set of specifications which have been interpreted differently by different people to say, yeah, this is what you need to do to connect to our system, right? So if you go to FreshBooks, for example, and you look at their developer docs, or you go to Zendesk and you look at their developer docs, or you go to Google and you look at their development docs, they're each going to have different levels of quality and depth to what they consider to be an API. And in some cases, they will use, they'll say, well, we use SOAP over this protocol with these WSDLs and these XML schema documents, in which case, if they actually did them right, you're in pretty good luck, because you can use tools to help you solve it. In other cases, it's going to be like this Word document that someone wrote up at the last minute just so that some marketing guy could check box that they have an API, and it doesn't really work, or it's very vague as to what's actually happening. So, the API intent is to have enough information so that you don't need to communicate a lot while you're building systems, and you need to have reasonably complete coverage of all these different topics, right? Schema, choreography, transport, encoding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, very few specifications, other than from the very largest companies, actually address all of this. But if you want a successful deployment, you need to know how you're handling all this, which means you pick up the phone and call the guy, which is against what the entire original intent is. So, this is my definition. All right, so what do we need to know? Okay, so we need to understand our own local environment. So from FileMaker perspective, that means we have to actually understand, for example, well, does FileMaker do HTTP GET? Does it do HTTP POST? How many people think FileMaker does HTTP GET? How many people know what I'm talking about when I say HTTP GET? Okay. All right. These are all internet protocols. Every time you talk over the internet using the TCP/IP protocol, there are very standard packet configurations that can be set up to invoke methods at the far end. A GET is basically when you want to get information. A POST is one of the ways you can push information out. Okay, and if you want to do it securely with a secure server, then it's HTTPS GET or HTTPS POST. FileMaker does do HTTP GET. It does not do natively HTTP POST. SOAP usually is implemented as an HTTP POST protocol, which means you can't just use FileMaker out of the box to do it. You have to write a plugin, you have to buy some of this plugin, you have to write your own PHP layer. I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also need to know about the local system, what grammars does it support. So if you're actually looking at wiring these things up, you can go, well, okay, I can screen scrape through the web viewer. That's one option. I can import. I can save a file to disk and import it. I can make a URL query and do something somehow with what comes back. I can use import records creatively and get data in. So we have to know all the stuff about FileMaker, for example. Then you have to understand what's happening on the far end, like what their requirements are and what limitations they're going to put on you. And if it's a totally different grammar, then you got to figure out how you're going to connect the two together to transform the information from one to the other. So the ingredients that are used to do all this, there's something in the middle, usually. And even the plugins that we would acquire for FileMaker all use one of these technologies. They're either based on Java, they're based on PHP, they're based on JavaScript, or something. We can also use XSLT, which is incredibly powerful, but a huge pain in the butt to learn. But it is designed specifically for converting one flavor of XML into another. That's its entire reason for being. So if that's what you're dealing with, is working from one flavor of XML to another, and if you want to be fast, that's a really good way to go. And you can also do it to convert to text-based representations like JSON. If you're using PHP to handle your transformation, out of curiosity, how many people here code PHP? A few? No? All right. Well, in PHP, which is another rich and programming environment that's very powerful for doing websites and other things, there's no built-in hierarchical data structure. Right? XML is inherently hierarchical and tree-like in its structure. PHP has built-in arrays. And you can have arrays of arrays and do things like that, but it's not inherently designed for it. So there's a lot of work that has to be done when you're working between XML and PHP if you want to stay in the PHP environment of marshalling and demarshalling your values. So you have to take the XML and convert it into the appropriate array in PHP so that you can then work with it natively within PHP and then convert it back into the XML that the other guy wants. Okay. But if you know XSLT, you can actually invoke within PHP an XSLT transformation object so that you feed it the style sheet. So you can grab the XML as a variable, apply the XSLT, and get the XML out directly without having to go through the array marshal demarshal step, which is in 5.2, I think, is when that started. It was very powerful technology. I think that most of us, it's the very first time we're trying to do something through some other site, the easiest thing to try that's in the comfort zone is to set up a web viewer, point it to the thing, and see if you can scrape the data out of it. Okay, the downside with that is as soon as they change their structure or do anything, you have to recode, and you have no validation. You don't get any of the benefits of these other approaches. Plus, your FileMaker client may or may not actually have access to the other information. Whereas if you're doing things at a server level, you can deal with, static IPs and other things that might be required to talk to the other side. Am I going too fast? Am I going at the right pace? Okay. I'm going to talk for a minute comparing SOAP and JSON because these are the two current kind of popular ways of exchanging data. For structure, the formal specification for SOAP is using XML schema. That's what says, okay, for each one of those messages, do you remember that slide I had a few minutes ago that said, hi, I'd like my credentials, here are your credentials, hi, I'd like to get a list of my open orders, here they are. For each one of those messages, there would be an XML schema document that says, this is what the request needs to look like. It must have an ID. It must have it must have this. It may have this. You need at least two of those. The value of this has to be greater than this and less than that. All those sorts of data level issues are addressed in an XML schema document. The XML schema is an XML structure, but because it's in a schema document, there are tools that you can use that can validate your created message so that you know, this message conforms to their spec. The WSDL is the sequencing of these things. It says, first thou shalt do this, and then you might do that, and then you can do this, and then if this happens, you have to do that. Okay? So WSDL is this high-level choreography thing, and the WSDLs reference the XML schemas that talk about the nature of the messages themselves. Typically, we're doing HTTP post for it, although sometimes you'll get GETs. It has a really rich environment for handling encoding, so if you're dealing with